I'm 87 years old tonight, and for the first time in my life I'm afraid to fall asleep. Not because I'm afraid of dying. At my age, death stops feeling like a stranger. You slowly get used to the idea. Year after year, funeral after funeral. What frightens me is something else. It's the thought that if I close my eyes tonight, I might never get the chance to tell my wife the truth. For 43 years she has shared her life with me. The same house, the same dinner table, the same quiet evenings that slowly turn into a lifetime. She believes she knows the man she married. She trusts me completely. But there's something she never knew, a secret I buried so deep inside myself that even now, saying it feels almost impossible. I've carried it through birthdays, through the day our children were born, through every anniversary we celebrated together, and the worst part is, she never doubted me. She's asleep in the next room right now. The television is probably still on, like it always is when she falls asleep early. She thinks tonight is just another ordinary night in a long marriage. But for me, it might be the last chance I ever have to finally tell her the truth. I still remember the first day I saw her. It was the summer of 1959. The kind of summer that felt endless when you were young. The air smelled like fresh grass, and the whole world felt bigger than it really was. I was 19 years old, standing outside a small grocery store on Maple Street with a few dollars in my pocket and absolutely no idea what my life was going to become. And then she walked out of the store. She was holding a paper bag with both hands, trying to keep it from tearing at the bottom. I remember that because one apple rolled out and landed near my shoes. I bent down, picked it up, and handed it to her. She smiled and said thank you. It was the simplest moment you could imagine. Two strangers on a sidewalk, sharing a few awkward words. But somehow, that moment changed the rest of my life. Her name was Margaret. Most people called her Maggie, but I always liked saying her full name. Margaret had a calm way of speaking, like nothing in the world could rush her. Back then I was the opposite. I was restless, always chasing something I couldn't quite explain. I wanted success, respect, money, all the things young men think will make them feel important. Margaret didn't care about any of that. The first time we talked for more than a few minutes was a week later. I ran into her again outside the same grocery store, and this time we ended up walking together for almost an hour. She told me about her family, about the little house she grew up in on the edge of town, about how she wanted a quiet life someday. Nothing fancy. Just a small home, a garden, maybe a few children running around the yard. I remember laughing a little when she said that. Not because it sounded silly, but because it sounded so simple. At 19 years old, simple felt small to me. I thought life was supposed to be bigger than that. But Margaret didn't see it that way. To her, simple meant peace. We started seeing each other almost every day after that. Sometimes we'd walk through the park near the river. Other nights we'd sit in my old truck with the radio playing quietly while we talked about the future. She liked asking questions about my dreams. "What do you want your life to look like?" she asked me once. I didn't hesitate. "I want to be successful," I said. "I don't want to struggle the way my father did." Margaret listened quietly the way she always did. Then she said something that stayed with me for years. "Just don't forget what really matters while you're chasing all that." At the time, I nodded like I understood. But the truth is, I didn't. A year later, we were married. The wedding was small. Just family and a few friends inside a little church that smelled like old wood and candle wax. Margaret looked beautiful that day. Not in a flashy way, just honest and warm, the way she always was. I remember standing there beside her, promising to love and protect her for the rest of our lives. And in that moment, I meant every word. The first few years of our marriage were quiet but happy. We rented a small apartment above a hardware store downtown. The floors creaked whenever someone walked across them, and the kitchen window looked out over a narrow alley filled with stray cats. But Margaret loved that apartment. She filled it with little things that made it feel like home. Curtains she sewed herself. A small plant on the windowsill that she watered every morning. On Sundays we would cook breakfast together. Eggs, toast, and coffee. Nothing fancy. Margaret always hummed softly while she cooked. Sometimes old songs from the radio, sometimes melodies she made up herself. Those mornings were peaceful. The kind of moments you don't realize are important until many years later. Eventually we had children. First our son Daniel, then our daughter Emily 3 years later. The day Daniel was born, I remember holding him in my arms and feeling something shift inside me. Responsibility. Suddenly the world felt heavier, but also more meaningful. Margaret was an incredible mother, patient in ways I never learned to be. She could calm a crying baby in minutes, while I stood there feeling helpless. Our house slowly filled with the noise of family life. Toys on the floor. Laughter in the living room. The sound of little feet running down the hallway early in the morning. From the outside, our life looked perfect. And in many ways, it was. But there was something else growing quietly inside me during those years. Ambition. I worked long hours at a construction company, trying to move up. Every promotion felt like proof that I was becoming the man I always imagined I'd be. Margaret supported me completely. She never complained when I stayed late at work. Never argued when I missed dinners or school events. "If you believe in it, go for it," she would say. I told myself I was doing it for the family. For Margaret. For the kids. But looking back now, I realized something I didn't understand at the time. Every step forward in my career was slowly pulling me further away from the life Margaret had dreamed about. The quiet dinners. The slow mornings. The simple peace she once described to me on that long walk after the grocery store. At first, the distance was small. Just a few missed evenings. A few late nights at the office. But distance has a strange way of growing when you're not paying attention. Years passed quickly. Promotions came. Our house got bigger. Our bank account grew. By the time I turned 40, we were living in a beautiful home on the edge of town. The kind of place people admire when they drive by. 2 cars in the driveway. A wide backyard. A porch where Margaret liked to sit in the evenings with a cup of tea. Everyone thought we had built the perfect life. Friends would tell me how lucky I was. And every time they said it, I smiled and agreed. But deep down, something had already begun to change. Something small at first. So small that I barely noticed it. Until the night everything started to unravel. The night everything began to unravel didn't feel important at first. It was just another late evening at the office. I had stayed behind finishing paperwork after everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet in that hollow way offices get after dark, when the lights hum softly and the parking lot outside sits empty under the street lamps. I remember looking at the clock on the wall. 9:47 p.m. Margaret had probably already fed the kids and cleaned the kitchen. Daniel would be doing homework at the dining table, and Emily would be somewhere on the floor coloring pictures. For a moment I thought about leaving right then, going home early for once. But there was always something else to finish. One more report, one more call, one more step forward. Ambition has a way of convincing you that every sacrifice is temporary, that you'll make it up later, that the people who love you will understand. That night, one of my coworkers was still there too. Her name was Laura. She had joined the company a few months earlier and worked in the office next to mine. Laura was easy to talk to. She had a quick laugh and the kind of energy that made long workdays feel shorter. Sometimes when we both stayed late, we would end up talking while finishing paperwork. Nothing serious. Just conversation. That night she walked past my desk and said, "You're still here too?" I nodded. "Deadlines," I said. She leaned against the doorframe and smiled. "Come on," she said. "You look like you need a break." We ended up going to a small diner a few blocks from the office. The kind of place that stays open all night for truck drivers and night shift workers. I told myself it was harmless. Just two coworkers grabbing coffee. We talked about work at first. Then about life. About the strange ways people end up where they are. Laura asked me questions Margaret had asked years earlier. What did you want to be when you were younger? What were your biggest dreams? It felt strange answering those questions again. Almost like stepping back into a version of myself I hadn't thought about in years. The coffee turned into another cup. Then another. When I finally looked at the clock above the counter, it was almost midnight. For a moment I felt a small flicker of guilt. Margaret would be asleep by now. The kids too. I told myself it didn't matter. I would just tell her work had kept me late. And that was the moment something shifted. Not a dramatic moment. No lightning bolt. No sudden realization. Just a small line being crossed quietly. Over the next few months, those late nights became more common. Laura and I talked often at work. Sometimes about projects, sometimes about life. She had a way of making me feel understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. Looking back now, I realize something important. It wasn't really about her. It was about the version of myself I felt when I was around her. The younger man. The ambitious one. The one who still believed the world was wide open. At home, life had settled into routines. Dinner. Bills. School events. Quiet evenings where Margaret and I sometimes sat in the same room without saying much at all. None of that was Margaret's fault. She was the same kind, patient woman I had always known. But somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing the quiet beauty of that life. I started noticing what was missing instead. One evening after another late shift, Laura and I ended up back at that same diner. It was raining outside. The windows were streaked with water, and the neon sign buzzed faintly above the door. We talked for a long time. Longer than usual. At one point she asked me something that caught me off guard. "Are you happy?" she said. I didn't answer right away. I thought about Margaret sitting at home. About the children. About the house we had built together. "I should be," I said finally. Laura studied my face for a moment. "That's not the same thing," she said quietly. The words stayed with me. They followed me home that night. When I walked through the door, the house was dark except for a lamp in the living room. Margaret had fallen asleep on the couch with a book resting on her chest. The television was still on, playing some late-night program neither of us ever watched. I stood there for a moment, looking at her. 40 years later, I can still see that image perfectly. Her hair slightly messy from sleep. The soft rise and fall of her breathing. She looked peaceful. Safe. Completely unaware that something inside our life had already begun to crack. I gently took the book from her hands and placed it on the table. She stirred slightly as I covered her with a blanket. "Is that you?" she murmured sleepily. "Yeah," I whispered. "You're home late. Work ran long." She nodded and drifted back to sleep. And that's when the guilt hit me for the first time. A quiet, uncomfortable feeling in my chest. Not because I had done something unforgivable yet, but because I knew I was standing closer to that line than I had ever been before. The weeks that followed blurred together. Work got busier. Laura and I spent more time together. Sometimes it was just conversations in the office. Other times it was coffee after work. Once or twice it was dinner when meetings ran late. Each time, I told myself the same thing. It's harmless. It doesn't mean anything. But secrets have a way of growing heavier the longer you carry them. One night, after another long evening at the office, Laura and I stayed behind finishing a project. Everyone else had already gone home. The building was silent. At some point our conversation drifted away from work again. She told me about her past. About relationships that hadn't worked out. About feeling like she was always chasing a life she hadn't quite found yet. Then she looked at me. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you made different choices?" she asked. The question hung in the air between us. I thought about Margaret again. About the promise I had made standing beside her in that small church years ago. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said something that still echoes in my mind to this day. "Sometimes," I admitted. Laura didn't say anything else after that. She just looked at me. And in that quiet moment, I knew something had already gone too far, even if neither of us had said it out loud yet. For years after that night, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Just a mistake. Something small that happened once and then disappeared into the past. But the truth is, mistakes like that never really disappear. They settle somewhere deep inside you. Quiet. Hidden. Waiting. At first, life continued as if nothing had changed. I went to work every morning. I came home every evening. Margaret greeted me at the door the same way she always had, with that gentle smile that made our house feel warm no matter how tired I was. Dinner happened at the same table. The kids told stories about school. The television hummed softly in the living room. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But inside me, something had shifted. Every time Margaret looked at me with those calm, trusting eyes, I felt it. That quiet weight sitting in the center of my chest. Because she believed she knew the man she married. And I knew there was a part of me she would never recognize. For a long time, I told myself the lie that people like to believe when they make a terrible decision. It didn't mean anything. It was just a moment. It doesn't change the life we built. So I buried it. I buried it beneath years of normal life. Years turned into decades. Daniel grew up and left for college. I still remember the day we dropped him off. Margaret cried the entire drive home while I pretended not to notice. Emily followed a few years later, chasing her own dreams in another city. The house slowly became quiet again. Just the two of us. Margaret and I began living the kind of peaceful life she had always dreamed about when we were young. Slow mornings. Coffee on the porch. Evenings where we sat together watching the sky turn orange behind the trees. Sometimes she would reach over and squeeze my hand without saying anything. Those small moments should have felt like happiness. But every now and then, the past would come back. Not loudly. Just small reminders. A memory that appeared while I was shaving in the morning. A thought that slipped into my mind while Margaret was talking about something simple like grocery shopping or the grandchildren. And every time it happened, I felt the same quiet question forming inside me. Does she deserve to know? But then I would look at her. I would see the peaceful life we had built together. And fear would answer that question for me. If I tell her, everything might break. So I stayed silent. Years continued to move forward the way years always do. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries came and went. We celebrated 40 years of marriage surrounded by family. The house was filled with laughter and grandchildren running through the hallway. At one point that evening, someone raised a glass and said something I will never forget. To Margaret and Tom, he said. 40 years of love and loyalty. Everyone clapped. Margaret leaned her head gently against my shoulder. And I smiled, the way you smile when everyone believes a beautiful story. But inside me, something twisted. Because loyalty is a strange word when you've spent decades hiding a truth from the person who trusts you most. A few years ago, something happened that forced me to look at my life in a way I never had before. Margaret got sick. At first it seemed small. Just fatigue. A few doctor visits. Some tests the doctor said were probably nothing serious. But weeks turned into months. And suddenly hospitals became part of our routine. I remember one particular evening in that hospital room more clearly than anything else in my life. The sun was setting outside the window, filling the room with a soft orange glow. Margaret was sitting up in bed, looking tired but peaceful. I was sitting beside her, holding her hand. She looked at me for a long moment, the same way she used to look at me when we were young. Then she smiled. "You know something," she said quietly. "What?" I asked. "I've had a beautiful life." Those words landed on me like a weight. She squeezed my hand gently. 43 years with you, she said. I wouldn't change that for anything. I felt something break inside my chest when she said that. Because Margaret believed every moment of our life together had been built on honesty. She believed the man sitting beside her had never betrayed her trust. And in that moment, I realized something that terrified me. She had lived her entire life loving me without doubt, while I had spent decades loving her with a secret buried in my heart. That night, when we returned home from the hospital, Margaret fell asleep early. The house was quiet, the same quiet that has filled our evenings for years now. I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, and for the first time in decades, I allowed myself to think about that night again. About the moment everything changed. About the lie I carried through birthdays, anniversaries, and every "I love you" I ever said to her. Now I'm 87 years old. Time moves differently when you reach this age. You begin to realize there are more memories behind you than days ahead. And suddenly the things you buried for years start rising back to the surface. Margaret is asleep in the next room right now, just like she has been on thousands of nights before. The television is probably still on, humming softly in the dark the way it always does when she falls asleep watching it. She thinks tonight is just another quiet evening in a long marriage. But for me, tonight feels different. Because for the first time in 43 years, I'm asking myself a question I was always too afraid to face. What if the truth I hid all these years was something she deserved to hear? What if love isn't just about protecting someone from pain, but about trusting them with the truth? I don't know what will happen if I walk into that room and wake her up. Maybe she'll forgive me. Maybe she won't. But I do know one thing now that I wish I had understood when I was younger. Regret doesn't fade with time. It waits. Quietly. Patiently. Until one day you realize that the words you were too afraid to say have been following you your entire life. And if you're lucky enough to still have the person you love sleeping in the next room, don't wait 40 years the way I did. Tell them the truth while you still can.